I'm going to move on to our next speaker. That is Esmee Geerken, Dr. Esmee Geerken. She is an artist and a earth scientist. She did a PhD on biomineralization at the Netherlands Institute for Sea Research. Currently, she's a guest researcher at the AMOF, the Institute for Atomic and Molecular Physics in Amsterdam. She's a research fellow at the Waag in Amsterdam, and she is also the Artist Science Fellow at the University of Amsterdam Institute for Advanced Study, which is where we met. She gave her opening lecture, and I realized how much her project and my interests overlap. She works on self-organization and how living but also non-living forms interact with their environment through the act of building, whether it's cells, bodies, crystals, houses, cities or identities. So she's going to talk about blobs of order, being in between, below, above. And she will explore how shapes emerge from fields or primordial soups or oceans or from mind. So Esmee, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, Sarah, thank you so much for inviting me. And Eric, thanks for this amazing lecture. I'm still really processing it. So I'm very honored to be speaking amongst these super interesting other speakers. A little disclaimer, I'm not really gonna say anything really about a theory of consciousness because I don't have one. Rather, for today, I would like to take you on a journey. It's a personal story about me trying to understand the world and the other and shapes. A story about getting lost and searching for paths. Also a story about my teachers. And like many other stories, this story starts with the void. So around a year ago, it was a night. It was just a couple of days before full moon. I went on my first night dive. And what you see here on the screen is actually the footage of that dive, shot by my dive instructor and friend, DJ de Bakker. And I don't know if you have ever been diving, but if you have, or also if you haven't, you can probably imagine that I was quite excited to enter the sea in the darkness. So therefore I was holding on to my friend's sleeve and we gently floated along the reef until my friend remained buoyant at one spot, which is what you're looking at now. So what he saw was this Medusa star releasing her egg cells into the water. So cells that would have to meet another cell to collide into a new Medusa star. And suddenly, the whole reef appeared to be full of proliferation. So what we saw was a synchronized spawning event. And this was paced by the light of the moon, so the lunar cycle. So we saw these sea snails that you see here, but also giant clams that you see on the right side and sea cucumbers. And they were basically all coming into the sea. And as you can imagine, this was very exciting for us to see this, sort of reef form. And in our excitement, I suddenly lost my friend. And if you have done a night dive, you can imagine that I was just floating in the darkness. I was trying to find back my friend, but I could only see these pocket lights and I couldn't recognize who was my friend. And actually, coincidentally, another group of divers passed by. So there were all these divers and pocket lights, but still I didn't know who to cling on to. And in this moment, I was instantly going back to this really deep primordial fear. And maybe some of you are familiar with this fear. It's the fear of floating alone in the vacuum, the black void, where you can't reach anyone else and no one can reach you. And it felt very scary. But then recently, I found consolation for my fear of the black void, of the emptiness, of being alone in the dark. And this was a moment where I was cooking. So I was in my kitchen and I was cutting an onion. And in the meantime, I was listening to a podcast of Sam Harris interviewing Frank Wilczek, a physicist like Erik. And Wilczek was explaining, the podcast was called How to Build a Universe. Wilczek was explaining that what we perceive as a vacuum sometimes, if you're not a physicist probably, is actually not empty. It's better to see it as this field. And from within this field, I'm happy that I'm after Erik, who already explained emergence. You have kind of these excitations of these quantum particles and quarks. So you can see these as kind of like excitations that appear and annihilate each other from within this field. And from these smallest blocks, I mean, Erik can explain this much better. You can build up this standard model. So atoms arise. They interact, form bodies of gases and liquids and solids, gathering together in galaxies and solar systems like our own and planets. And in this moment, listening to Wilczek explaining the standard model, suddenly I had this feeling and it all kind of clicked for me. I just could suddenly feel, while I was cutting a paprika, I think, how I am also this sort of blob of order within this kind of primordial soup. And I realized that instead of being this separate piece of matter in this empty space alone, I realized that I'm more like this dense meatball in this rather thin primordial soup. And what really consoled me in Wilczek's words was that I cannot be left alone by that what I am made of. And that brings me to shapes. So I am a shape with my body. And I think I've always been, like, I guess many of you, I've always been very interested in blobs of order, like, who am I? What am I? Who are you? How is this stone formed, or this stone, or the shell? Or the earth, or the planets. And this is why after Art Academy, I continued to study earth sciences. And that also brings me to introduce you to my teachers. So I met my teacher during my earth science study. And this was my teacher. It's called Minifra. And Minifra are these unicellular organisms that inhabit the oceans. They're with many, many, many. And they secrete these calcite shells. You can see this spiral, it adds these chambers. So during my PhD, I spent countless hours behind the microscope studying how they secrete their shell. And here you see, in the lower side, you see the appearance of a new chamber. And in these quite intimate moments with my study object, I started to really be quite amazed by, these shells appearing out of seawater, kind of also emerging. And I had these questions like, is the shell a living form or is it non-living? Can you actually distinguish between living or non-living, or is it more like a scale? And I became really fascinated by minerals, but also by life kind of using minerals to grow bones and skulls and shells, basically. But of course, there are differences between living systems and non-living matter. So for that, let's look at a mineral. So this shell you see here is made of calcite, but then grown by a living unicellular being, which is quite insane if you see that they make these beautiful cells. But then now you see a calcite cube. And what's different, or so what's the nature of like minerals, crystals? They have a very elegant way to grow and to remain their shape. They actually don't need to eat to do this. They don't need to eat a lot of dark chocolate like I do all the time. Basically, they have this crystal structure, and then they can just grow. Sometimes they dissolve and have this almost platonic shape. I actually have some platonic shapes here too. And it's really quite amazing if you think about it, that here this cube is 3 micrometers in diameter, and here I have the same shape, which is 3 centimeter in diameter. Sorry, but it has exactly the same shape. So imagine your own body being 10,000 times smaller or 10,000 times larger, like this cube. That's pretty amazing, right? But then if we continue to life, so what makes life different? Well, then we talk about this equilibrium. And recently I fell in love with this new theory on the origin of life by Dr. Eric Smith, who was at the Santa Fe Institute that some of you might know. So I can really recommend his book, probably it's mirrored. And I'm going to try to not explain his theory entirely, but you can look up his video on YouTube or buy the book. Basically, what the take-home message is for this talk is that you can imagine that order appears spontaneously when energy channels are formed, like lightning bolts or like weather patterns in the weather. Basically, all these patterns, they can emerge by energy flows. And Eric's explaining this. I'm really going to try to explain his amazing theory in 1 minute. He explains, if we think about what is the essence of life, of living shapes, Eric takes us back to the deep, deep ocean. So probably life emerged near hydrothermal vents. These are kind of these underwater volcanoes that you see here. And what Eric Smith explains is that basically the Earth system is out of equilibrium. So you have all this heat within the Earth and it needs to escape. So that's what you see here. It escapes through the crust of the Earth, so the lithosphere, the rocks. Then it enters the ocean. And the ocean, of course, is connected with the atmosphere, which is connected to the sun. And then you can imagine that life through metabolism is actually a much more efficient way to catalyze or to let energy flow through. So actually energy, you could see that as electrons being passed on. And then this created this massive battery where life actually is, in his words, quite logical to emerge because it's a faster way to get rid of this energy that needs to escape. So it's basically life is kind of a pattern, but then quite a complex pattern if you compare it to this crystal shape, right? I mean, I'm quite a complex person. And then, I don't know, I always admire this crystal for its simplicity and beauty, of course. So I think it's just interesting to think, if you think like, okay, I need to eat to maintain my shape. And of course, then we get back to this Platonic thing Eric Verlinde was mentioning, that I have the shape and I have this idea of the eye or my eye that remains kind of the same while it's also changing. And then you could think, okay, I need to eat a lot of chocolate to maintain this shape, this Platonic shape of the Esmee. But actually, you could also flip the coin and think, actually, energy is the essence of my form. So I am this energy at many levels. Well, I thought it was just amazing to think about. And this also brings us to the next topic, which is sex. I'll take a sip of water while you imagine what this will be about. So what I would call living blobs of order, like myself or this crystal. Oh, well, this is maybe not a living blob, but the shell, you can wonder, is it like, was it living? Is it living? But also my thoughts are, they are a little bit more complex. They have more information. There's more information needed to reconstruct them than you would need for this crystal. So that also means that life is vulnerable because it's complex and it's prone to errors, which means that I could fall apart and dissolve into this chaos again. And then, but to remain this kind of energy channel that is searching for this path to keep this battery running, then if you flip the coin, you can also think that if you think about reproduction and evolution, that kind of really fits into that idea, right? So here you see a Minifra reproducing. They are really amazing. They can reproduce asexually, what it did just here. So it just split the cell in new cells, but then you don't really include diversity, and you need diversity to be more resilient against errors, right? So Minifra can also reproduce sexually, like also the Medusa star and the sea cucumber you saw in the video by DJ, and also like myself. I didn't really manage to do so yet. And I'd like to ask you now to close your eyes for a moment. And I would like to ask you to imagine that you are in the middle of a really large braiding river. So you are a moment in a flow. You are this flow of energy that's flowing through you. And then you can imagine all the branches that branch towards you, behind you. So these can be your ancestors, right? So your parents, your grandparents, their parents, all these branches that led to you being you in the midst of this braiding stream. And then even maybe you can extend your imagination further back, and you can feel how there were primates and maybe fish and maybe once unicellular organisms at these hydrothermal vents you've just been looking at. And you're just somewhere in this path. And maybe you can also look into the future, and you don't know what will happen. And it's really nice to not predict what will happen, but just imagine that there is an unknown future, and it might branch out. There might be children, or there might be works of art or science or theories or creativity. And at some point, maybe branches will reach the ocean. So imagine that you are this energy searching for a path, like a lightning bolt. And you're in the midst of this large braiding river that's evolving, pulsating, mutating, branching into many dimensions. Okay, you can open your eyes again. So now, yes, I'm gonna maybe say a little bit, and maybe I'm gonna try to like bring together what Wilczek said with what Eric Smith said, and then actually I think Eric Verlinde already combined this into one. So I'm gonna do the same, but in a very reductionist way. So if you have this universal field, you can imagine the excitations of these quarks and the neurons and the protons and the electrons that then somehow are all interacting and become atoms, or sometimes they disappear again. They form these gases, liquids and solids. These are ordered into galaxies and solar systems. And then if you look at our solar system, Eric Smith explained how the biosphere emerges from our planet in the connection with the sun and being out of equilibrium. Then if you kind of zoom into there, but I needed a new blob there. What I really liked also about both Eric's talks is this idea of emergence, that you can look at order appearing out of more chemically heterogeneous fields or backgrounds. So you could say organisms form ecosystems, but you can also think ecosystems, they are quite heterogeneous in their chemistry, and then species crystallize from this, like a crystal crystallizes or precipitates from a liquid. So species like giraffes or the sea cucumber or humans. Then within these species, there's organisms. So it's maybe you or me that's kind of condensed from this field of the species. And then within my body, I have my heart, my liver, my brain, and then the brain and all these organs, they are composed of cells and neurons. And then you can actually, this is where the snake bites the tail. So actually this Penrose figure was a bit more connected, or also actually this image that Eric showed before. So these kind of connect back into atoms and subatomic particles and into this universal field, right? Okay, so I really don't know where the sense of self comes from, or if this crystal has a consciousness. So maybe that's something we can discuss in the panel discussion. But then there is, from my own first-hand perspective, I have this sense of self. And then, I don't know, maybe it is an emergent feature of all these interacting neurons that are within my body, that are within an organism that is, through being part of the same background, can have an empathy or an imagination what it's like to be another human, or maybe going a background further back in background. I could maybe have some kind of idea what it's like to be a bat, but we're also very different. So we have a different ecosystem perhaps, or the same ecosystem. So you can imagine that, well, I could imagine that the sense of self appears at many levels, and I don't know where. But my question for the other panelists is, do you think it's possible, as a scientist or as a human or as a Buddhist or as an animal, that you have the sense of self and it can be quite condensed, right? Like in your ego, where you are really like, okay, I'm thinking, I am an I, and you have all these thoughts. And then you can sort of become aware of your thoughts. Then I can extend the sense of self or my consciousness into my body and, start to feel my toes again, which, sometimes you forget if you are a scientist and you think all the time. And maybe you can even extend your awareness into the realm of species and ecosystems, and kind of going back into, just submerging in this universal field. And I don't know if this is my imagination and knowledge that becomes sort of entangled with my experience. So this is just interesting to think about. And it does also make me wonder, what are the boundaries of the self? And this brings me to the next topic, which is boundaries. And there I was inspired by Minifra, because their name literally means hole bearers. So fora, holes, and they have many holes. And I started to think about, if you have all these different blobs of order, they need, of course, boundaries to maintain their shape, to maintain this Platonic idea, if you talk about the idea of the I or the ego, but also just my cells. They need pretty sturdy membranes that are semi-permeable, so they can allow some calcium ions and CO2 to maybe be pumped in or diffuse out. And I find it quite interesting to just think about how living forms, like my material body, needs quite strong boundaries, like the membranes of my cells, because life, it's such a high energy thing that if I don't have boundaries, I will just dissolve into chaos again, or into the ecosystem, right? And then if you think of non-living systems, like the coupled ocean atmosphere system, if you imagine the surface of the sea, it doesn't really have a membrane, but it's still a surface. So there we talk, in earth sciences, we talk a lot about diffusive boundaries. And in non-living systems, because the energy is less, high, these boundaries can be more diffusive. And then I wondered, what about the boundaries of the self? And then I just like to, look at these shells and imagine, how they create all these pores. And and it's funny because I've been looking at them for more than 5 years. And now when I go out, I can only see our houses also as these huge shells. And to take this one step further, 2 years ago, I did hypnotherapy. And then we would also use this image of the house as to stand for the self, which is kind of a Jungian psychoanalysis idea that the house is also a self. So looking at these Minifra, I was just wondering about, how can you extend and retract your boundaries? How can you be more permeable to feel more one with the ocean? But how can you also be rigid enough to so that others cannot invade you, or that you kind of maintain your ego? Because sometimes, maybe you're in high school and you need an identity to, just keep on standing amongst your peers. So I just find this an interesting way to just think about, when do I want to be more permeable and feel part of the whole? And when is it actually wonderful to celebrate individuality? Here, like a tiny sidetrack is that I was really, it's really cool. Like if you see the shell really zoomed in, you see these like cogwheels, and you see the same with our skulls. I couldn't really show you my skull, but here a skull of a deer. And it's so amazing that something that evolved 500 million years ago, this kind of skull, still has these same patterns in how it connects. And then Minifra also made these flotation chambers where they fill it with gas and then they can just float somewhere else. So there's just a lot of allegories to think about the self and porosity, and how can you let thoughts go out to reach someone else? How can love come in? When do you need to protect yourself? Become a bit more rigid. Well, for me personally, these were very important questions to think about. And I just want to stress that both are amazing and important. So it's amazing to celebrate individuality and look at these beautiful cells and shells and individual personalities. And it doesn't have to, you can celebrate individuality of a giraffe or of a person or you or me, while you at the same time feel part of these bigger backgrounds, like feeling part of the ecosystem and the biosphere and taking care of the ecosystem, feeling part of the ocean. So yes, I started to really wonder, how can I come home into myself? How can I just let go of this really narrow self and just extend a bit into my toes again, into my fingers? How can I be in between, below, above? And where is the middle? So these were questions that I was thinking about. And then I recently was happy that I found kind of this pathway for homecoming. Yeah, basically a home which is larger than myself, but also can celebrate the individual. And basically this had to do a lot with letting go of this desire for control and predictions, of this prediction brain. And yes, I found the beginning of this path. Well, of course, I was led there by Minifra and my curiosity about biominerals. I found this path in a chemical laboratory. And no, this wasn't a drug laboratory for LSD or something. It was, Sarah mentioned it already, the self-organizing matter lab. Because a couple of years ago on a conference on biomineralization, I met Wim Noortijn and his PhD students, and they work on crystallizing or precipitating these really amazing forms, minerals, crystals, out of liquids. And they can do this by controlling, so there's still a bit of control, the liquid, like the pH and the elements present. But then there's also emergence. So they can't predict what's growing. They're not designing the shapes. They kind of let them grow while playing with them. So what you see here is kind of these blooming silicate minerals that are grown by PhD candidate Marloes Bisterveld. And I'm always so amazed by her work. It's just really a celebration of these crystals appearing out of backgrounds and also dissolving again. So I'll just fast forward it. Okay, well, actually, I just sort of looped this, but you can imagine. So this is how Wim's work look like. So he grows these shapes out of liquids in these amazing forms. And when I saw his work, I was like, I knew this is what I want to do. So I started to do my own experiments. And in these experiments, I'm kind of searching for the sweet spot between order and chaos. And in this, I was inspired by the former IS director, Peter Sloot, who explains that order is predictable because, you know, all these atoms are just bumping into each other. Chaos is predictable with all these atoms, and then order, like this crystal, is also predictable. But at the edge between order and chaos, this is where complexity happens and new shapes emerge, and probably also complex things like societies and cities and our minds and our egos and etc. So I started to play with bringing together unexpected agents like organic materials and minerals. And then I started to grow these forms that I could have never designed, which is great because I'm a terrible designer. As soon as I'm trying to design something, it's just a disaster. So I was super happy that I could play with emergence because I was letting go of control. So here you see my own blood cells that are interacting with the calcite mineral, forming these landscapes. And doing this really inspired me to also apply this to my own life. So I'm now constantly searching, like, when can I let go of this prediction brain? When can I let go of my desire for control? When can I let thoughts just emerge? When can ideas just emerge? When can love also just emerge? You know, when I'm not trying to control it so much. So yeah, for me, this is just a very exciting thing to play with. So I would like to end this talk with saying that, yeah, I don't really have an answer as to where consciousness emerges. I mean, I could imagine it's emerging in the interaction somewhere. But I was really wondering also, you know, about unicellularity and multicellularity, like when is there an individual and when is there a community? And can you actually tell the difference? So I wondered about a sperm cell. What if a sperm cell leaves the male body? Is it unicellular at that time? And I really felt, you know, this courageous desire of this energy flow searching for its path, where the sperm cell just left the comfort of the male body and just went to look for an egg cell, even though, you know, especially these days, often it's kind of failing. So I thought maybe the sperm cell needs a shell to feel more protected. And I'm going to leave you with the image of the shell that the sperm cell created, which is this one. So zooming in, you see the head of the sperm cell and the tail, and then this blob is kind of the shell it formed. Yes, so thank you so much. And thanks also for all my collaborators and friends that I had interesting conversations with. So thank you.
Thank you, Esmee. That was inspirational. We have a couple of minutes and we have questions coming in, so I'm going to jump straight to one of the audience questions. Dogan says, Stephen Wolfram is proposing a theory of reality based on cellular automata, like the game of life. Is your idea of blobs a similar concept?
Yes, I think so. I guess I've been also really inspired by all these complexity scientists from the IS. So I wouldn't really say that this is my theory. I think I'm just more speaking from my experience and just this moment that I listened to this podcast and that I could just feel that I'm a blob. And I guess it's very related to the idea of cellular automata, where just complexity is emerging. And at some point it's so complex that as being within this system, you cannot oversee it, right?
Yeah.
But it's just a nice, comforting idea for me.
Okay, thank you. And we have another one, Lawrence. He says, beautiful, soulful contribution, Esmee. What do you recommend to continue investigating the parallel with Jungian psychology and the blobs as you spoke about? Perhaps also from your own experience or studies?
Yes, that's a beautiful question. Yeah, I was thinking about doing hypnosis for architects. So I'm working with architects also because I'm really inspired in this idea of self-organization. And then I'm not an architect, but I like to talk with architects and have their ideas on how they use self-organization and emergence in building cities. And I think it would be really interesting to use this idea of hypnosis with architects also. So that's one idea that I'm working on. And otherwise, yeah, I think I don't really know yet what will happen, but it's just a nice way to think in the analogy. But then it's also nice to go beyond analogy. So I will definitely continue it. I don't know how.
You're going to let it emerge.
Yes.
Yes, very good.